that today we get to talk about the teaching statements piece of the faculty job application. So in a second, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Kim Bell. But for now, I just want to welcome everyone. And just in terms of how the session will run today, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Molly Latz. I'm the Director for Research Training Initiatives in the Graduate School, but I know pretty much all of you already. I think all of you through this series and through other things. So today, as our speaker is going through the presentation, if you have questions, you can submit them to the Q&A feature in Zoom. You can also throw them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that as well. And I think we'll have some time at the end to address questions too. But for now, I will turn it over to our speaker, Dr. Kimberly Bell, who is the Teaching Assistant Development Specialist in the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Molly. Hi, everyone. I see a lot of friends and familiar faces, or at least names, in the room. Welcome. I'm happy to be here today to talk about developing your teaching statement. And as Molly said, feel free to put questions anywhere, interrupt, raise your hand, whichever you need to get your questions answered. And we should have some time at the end if that's what you prefer to. So I'm just going to share my presentation. There's a QR code here if you want to get the slides right now. And this is where also being recorded, so you'll have ways to catch up and go through everything again after. Molly, you'll share the slides, I'm assuming. Also, I'll make sure I send you them. Great. So some folks are still coming in. Welcome. Hello. And as Molly said, I'm the Teaching Assistant Development Specialist in SELP, but I also work with postdocs. Anything you all need related to teaching development, I've worked with a bunch of you before. And just, I know you have your statement review piece of this coming up in a couple of weeks, but if there's anything else I could do to help moving forward, please, don't hesitate to contact me as well. Okay, so let's get into it. Just going to do a little getting to know each other for the folks who may not know each other in the room. And just, I always like to start off with, like I said, knowing a little bit more about the folks in the room. So we're going to do something called a chatterfall. I don't know if you've seen this before. It's been my recent favorite way to do icebreakers in Zoom. So we're going to type your answer out in the chat, but don't send it yet. I'm going to give everyone a minute to answer the questions I put, and don't worry, it's nothing crazy, just pretty quick and easy. And then when I say so, we can all send our answers in the chat, and I will participate as well. Molly and Diana, feel free to participate also if you feel like it. All right, so again, I just said quick and easy. Are you a grad student or postdoc or other? What program or department are you in? And then if you are comfortable sharing, what is one of your hobbies or favorite foods? Again, just get your answer ready in the chat and I'll let you know when to send. I always feel like there should be music or something playing in the background when I do this. And Zoom actually does have a music app, which I've been wanting to try out, but I don't want to mess that up right now after not testing it. So, all right. So I see some answers coming through. So why didn't everybody send if you haven't? Yay. And see, they all come up. How fun. Just makes it a little easier to go through everything and give folks a minute or two to think about their answers. So great. I'm just going to scroll through my chat. A nice mix of postdocs and grad students from different disciplines. Got baking and cooking as hobbies, tacos, that's also one of my favorite foods. Building with Legos. I also like building with Legos. Tropical fruits. Pistachio lavender pizza. That sounds awesome. I wrote potatoes. Anything to do with potatoes, I like. Bouldering. What is that? Is that like rock climbing, Katie?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, cool. Nice. Knitting, baking, running, nachos. Yep. Great. Burritos. Could make a Mexican restaurant. Bar classes. Oh, Diana's got a lot of hobbies. I always love hearing about Diana's hobbies. Bread and butter, yeah, pasta, right on the carb track with me there. And then music and barbecue. Awesome. Well, really nice to meet all of you if I haven't met you already. And hopefully we'll get ready today. We're going to have a little bit more participation. I have some writing prompts to go through towards the end for just a short, few minutes of writing. And if you want to share after that, we'll have some time for that too. Okay, so our learning objectives for this session will define elements of an effective teaching statement, describe possible structures for your statement, identify topics and themes you can include in your statement, start to develop your statement through reflection and writing prompts. I missed a word there, and then plan the next steps for developing and writing your statement. I think a few of you have seen this presentation before, so if it's very similar, a refresh is always good. But like I said, too, if you want to follow up with me after, you're also welcome to do that. Okay, so we're going to start with a poll. What do you value about teaching and learning? Words and phrases are fine. You don't have to write full sentences. If you've been following along with the slides so far, there's some ways to join this poll on the slide, but I'm going to hop over to the poll. There's also joining instructions and the QR code on there as well. This should be active and your answer should pop up here as you type. So we'll take a few minutes for this. And this could be from a learner perspective. It could be from a teaching experience you've had, just some general words and phrases. What do you value about teaching and learning? They're great so far. Yeah, 3 light bulb moments in a row. That's great. That is a fantastic part of teaching: community, growth, right? Reflection, trying out new things, innovating, active interaction, mentoring, writing as a process. So great, a little bit more discipline based, sharing what I've benefited from. Yeah. Discovering new ideas, right? So a few of you have seen this in your students, which is fantastic. That really shows that you are dedicated to successful student engagement, making students understand complex research and topics in simple words, right? Yeah. Conveying complex information, especially in, it's really any discipline has their own jargon and complex information. So that's also a critical piece of teaching, especially in higher education. All right, great. Awesome. Thanks for your participation. I'm going to go back over to the slides. So we're going to come back to that question in a couple of different ways throughout the session, but just for the good news, you've pretty much already gotten started on your teaching philosophy just through that reflection. right? Some intentional thinking about what you value in teaching and learning gives you a great jumping off point to start your writing. So just in case, you haven't thought about the specifics of what goes into a statement of teaching philosophy, just some generalities here. The statement is a narrative, so it's basically a story you're telling. It's okay that it's in first person, right? It's very personal and specific to you, your experiences and your values of teaching. So it's your conception of teaching and learning, a description of how you teach, a justification for why you teach that way, right, in a broad sense. So the statement should demonstrate that you have been or will be reflective and purposeful about your teaching, right? So you're learning along with your students what works well, what shows that they're learning, and how you can continue your growth as an educator. Communicate your goals as an instructor and your corresponding actions in the classroom. So there needs to be a really tight connection between, the more theoretical concepts of teaching or the values you're discussing and the practice and really what's going on in the classroom or the mentoring circumstances or whatever context you're talking about. And you want to provide evidence of your teaching effectiveness. And this isn't just, feedback from students saying this, but what are you doing to assess learning in your classroom? How do you really know that your students are learning what you're trying to convey? So that should come across throughout your specific examples in your story of your teaching philosophy. So just for some quick tips, and of course this isn't exhaustive, but it's a place to start. So just some do's and don'ts here. I mentioned the statement is a narrative, it's a story. That's how you're going to make your statement stand out from others, is sharing your personal experiences and anecdotes and, that narrative of you and your teaching values. You want to be concise, right? This isn't a 7 to 8 page statement. Typically, the statements are 1 to 2 pages. There's often not too many guidelines on length specifically in, job postings or things like that, but 1 to 2 pages is typical. Knowing your audience is important, right? You want to do some research on the institutions you're applying to, see if you could understand what their values around teaching and learning are from looking at different organization websites, like their, faculty centers, the department you're going to be working in. If there's syllabi available, you'll know what kind of courses you might be teaching, so you can tailor your statement specifically to the value you would bring to that institution, right, based on the experience and evidence that you already have. You use specific examples and evidence. You want to highlight your strengths and accomplishments, right? You've been doing a great job. You have, successes or learning experiences, and you want to talk about those. Citing the learning sciences literature, there's a little asterisk here, because depending on what specific position you're applying to, this could be valued more or less. I don't think it's ever a bad idea, but certainly if you're applying for a primarily teaching focused position, maybe at a smaller, primarily undergraduate institution, it might be more valuable to show that you really have this broad understanding from theory to practice and know a little bit about the learning sciences literature. And this isn't to say you need to become an expert on a whole new body of research. I have some suggestions later on in this presentation for things you might be able to cite or explore. And again, it might be you're citing one specific teaching practice you're using, right? And you don't have to really dive too much deeper into it than that. But again, it really depends on what type of position you're applying to. And if you want to talk more about that as you're preparing your statement, I'm happy to. And always get feedback on your draft. Even if you're filling out an application last minute, it's always worth it to try and get another pair of eyes and, just perspective on if it's flowing, if you're being specific enough, if your story is coming through. And then just a couple of don'ts. Don't use cliched or overly embellished language, right? This is supposed to be a specific and personal story. Don't attribute your success to luck, right? I mean, that could be perhaps part of the reality, but it's definitely not all of it. You've worked hard and you've come to the place you are now because of hard work and your own success. So project that confidence. But that has to be a balance too. You don't want to come across as too boastful right? Like I'm the best educator in the world, or lacking in confidence, right? You want to sound like a colleague of the department you're applying to, highlighting your strengths and what value you can bring both to the department, of course, and student success. Any questions so far? I'll just pause for a minute.
I don't know if you can hear me. I have a question.
Sure, Natalia, is that how you say your
Yes.
name?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So in the first part, like tell your story, is it like a prose of my curriculum or my resume, or what do they want when you say tell your story?
So yeah, so I mean, right, you want to start off with some kind of introduction paragraph, and we'll go through a couple of structures in a minute. Just talking about your values. Why are these things important to you? How have your experiences shaped what your philosophy is? And then you're telling your story sort of over and over through the statement, right? You're telling literal stories or using anecdotes from your classroom teaching or your mentoring. You're using specific examples of how you use certain teaching practices and how your students have responded to them. You're talking about how you're assessing student learning. So that's what I mean by that. Is that more
Okay.
clear?
Yes, it's more clear. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anyone else for now? I don't think there's anything in the chat. So there's a few different ways to structure your statement. I've sort of combined two of the ones that both I've used and seen the most often, but again, this isn't an exhaustive list. And I have a lot of additional resources at the end of this presentation for you as well that have a bunch of examples of different statements and different disciplines. Carrie, yes, I'll get to that question in a minute, but the short answer is yes. But we'll talk a little bit more about student feedback in a moment. So one way to structure your statement, I mentioned, you have to have an introduction and a conclusion in any statement. So you can start with the general goals or your values, maybe like a top 3 or something like that for student learning, and a brief description of your values. When you approach teaching, what do you want your students to get out of it, and what is important to you as an educator? And of course, your opening sentence should hook your reader in. This is another way to make your statement stand out from others, right? You don't want to start off with something like, right, just some general statement or a cliched term about, how awesome it is to be a teacher, right? You do want to convey passion and excitement for teaching, but you want to do it in an authentic and personal way. So after your introduction, you would give a brief description and additional details on maybe one specific course you have taught, right? So this is one of those options for structuring. You can talk about a couple of different courses that you have taught. Maybe you've taught a lab course and a lecture course, or you've done a summer program and lab mentoring, something like that. So you can give different specific courses as like your body paragraphs, or you can focus on these 3, I'm just going to keep saying top 3 values or teaching practices that you want to focus on. So then what methods have you used to accomplish that, either within your course? What are teaching practices you've used that were appropriate for that context or those students or that topic? And then if you're going with more of a values-based thing, right? Let's say you're talking about active learning. What sort of active learning strategies have you used, or are you planning to use? And then what evidence do you have, or can you have, if you haven't collected that yet, that this will be effective to help your students learn? And then it's kind of like rinse and repeat. You do that again for the body paragraphs. You're either talking about a different course type or you're talking about a different goal. And like I said, this isn't an exhaustive way to structure. I've seen other structures, and you'll see them in the examples, that you might want to use broader headings, right? Like breaking down classroom teaching versus mentoring versus assessment. And you can sort of have those mini topics within your statement as well. Let me see what's in the chat. Example, yeah, we're also going to go through that in a minute. Thanks for your question, Sumia. And then you have your conclusion. And this is where you can give an overall summary, based on these values and evidence you're talking about, overall, how do students benefit from your teaching? And then looking ahead, and you want to have some institution specific closing, either, they've been very specific in the job advertisement and told you you're going to be teaching, 4 classes of general biology, of genetics, of whatever, and you could talk about that more specifically. Or, you could say something more general, like I'm prepared to teach, in person, online, non-majors, courses, whatever. Again, based on the value alignment, your experiences, and what the job description says. So now I want us to brainstorm a little bit together. So that was a good timing for that question. Can you give examples of methods of teaching? So I'm going to try to type as we talk. So I'm going to take my thing out of presentation mode here. And I can help get started if we don't have any ideas, but either put in the chat or unmute. And let me know if you've thought about this a little already. What are some possible goals or practices or values that you might be able to focus on? I mentioned active learning before, and that's a huge topic with lots of subtopics in it, but we can list that to get started. So again, let's brainstorm together. You can unmute, you can raise your hand, you can type in the chat, and I'll get our stuff in this list here. What do we think? There's really no wrong answers here. Whatever we're brainstorming. Okay, great. There we go. Some stuff in the chat. Can I copy and paste the chat? Nope. Okay. Be patient with me while I type. Right. So these are all things you can value or use specifically as related to your discipline and your teaching. Yeah, 300 students in asynchronous classes is tricky. Carrie, if you ever wanted to talk about that more, I'm always happy to do consults as well. And so that's like another thing you could cite. I don't know if I included that here, but maybe we could try to get, there's an article about active learning by Freeman et al. That shows, like 200 studies showing that active learning increases learning gains in class. I could share that reference. And who was talking? Sorry.
Sorry, is think, pair, share an active learning?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Kristen. So think, pair, share. I'm gonna just write that here because that's something I recommend talking about a lot. For departments that have been doing active learning for a long time, think, pair, share is going to be pretty common, but it's also a great teaching strategy in general. That's pretty quick and easy. It's you can pose a question, like de novo, like new out of nowhere. Have students just pair up with somebody next to them, talk about it for a minute after doing the think part, right? Thinking is a little reflecting on their own. They get together and talk about it together and then share either with other groups or the whole class. And it's really customizable. You could also do it after, like, I don't know if anyone's used clicker questions, but after posing a poll question, let's say you have like a really close split in the class, have students turn and talk to each other, puzzle it out again, and then pose the same question. There is evidence showing too that as a teaching strategy that peer learning, that, the peers teach each other, those who had gotten the answer correct. Now the students that were a little confused, the second time that the question gets asked, it's like 80 to 100% correct because the students are learning from each other. So it's a great strategy. Kristen, were you going to add to that?
I think I might be missing some of what we should be adding here, but I know in the past when we've gone over like Bloom's taxonomy, that's helped a lot with me putting together my lesson objectives and just the course structure of like where in this pyramid do I want them to focus, instead of understanding everything or, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, you know, you can also turn that into sort of your value is course alignment, right? Like you are
Mhm.
writing objectives but also critical thinking that can relate to, right? So Bloom's taxonomy is sort of this cognitive framework of increasing complexity and what you want your students to accomplish. Right. And so if you're showing or have evidence that, you know, you're paying attention to getting students through like all the levels of Bloom's in your course, or, you know, your goal is to get them to that top critical thinking piece where they're creating new information. And that depends on the course you're teaching too, right? If you're teaching an intro course, sometimes you don't really get up to that level. But there's ways to do it with more active and creative assignments as well. So yeah, that's appropriate for this conversation here too. So Daphne?
Hi. It's Kristen might have kind of brought me into this question. It seems like with the exception of the last two, most of these are practices. So you said before values, and I was immediately kind of confused by that. Are there like a set of adjective buzzwords that are more commonly known for people really, neck deep in the education, like really teaching more than research side of things that I could tap into or research that I should be thinking about when I come up with values? Because I mean, like with the exception of like employing growth mindset, that could be like a value, I guess, to
Sure.
me,
Yeah.
or implementing Bloom's taxonomy. Could you go into more what you mean by values and things like that?
Sure. So I'm typing one now, like student engagement, I would say is more of a value that has lots of specific practices that you can that go under that sort of umbrella. And a lot of them you could connect right here. I just use these goals, practices, values so it can align with really whatever you're thinking. Um, I mean, and as far as buzzwords go, I mean, I'm going to type just a few more things that you might want to look into. But just having, you don't want to have the words there, just to have the words there either. But this will be a good start for that. And I really just want to do this so you can reflect on what might be important to you as an educator. But definitely things that are currently like hot topics, right, are, student engagement, accessibility, uh, teaching for all students, how do you individualize learning, things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And I understand your point about, not mindlessly using them. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah, no problem. Katie?
I have kind of a related question to that, I think. Something that I think about is like how as educators we can be just in general like kinder to people, and how that like kindness will, I think, allows for people to like feel comfortable and then be in an environment where they can learn, where they're like focused on the learning. Um,
Mm-hmm.
like, would something like kindness, I mean, phrased maybe in like a less like eat, pray, love kind of way, like
Yeah.
would that be like a value that you would consider exploring more in one of these teaching statements, or is that not really the idea?
No, I mean, that's a component of inclusive teaching, I would say, right? And you could turn that into like empathy, sense of belonging, which I'll write here too.
Okay. Okay.
Things that are maybe a little more connected to the evidence-based literature. But we read a book actually in the CIE Journal Club called, I think, The Pedagogy of Kindness.
Okay.
So that it is something that's definitely out there, right? But you want to connect that back to the practice and the evidence, and how that's going to positively impact student learning. As long as that's what you're showing,
Yeah.
then
Okay.
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I
Because
feel
that's one of your values, right? So
I feel like that Kim, you've mentioned this before, having students have their own classroom code of conduct. I feel like
mm-hmm.
maybe that fits in with some of those because I did that in my class I'm teaching now, and I feel like all the students were like, just be nice to each other. That was like our main
Yeah,
point for our code of
yeah,
conduct.
yeah. I mean, that's like my primary teaching advice, I would say too, is right, just don't be mean to your students. Have some empathy and compassion. Yeah. So I think having that as a base value and really connecting it to those practices that achieve that is valuable. Yeah. Just catching up with the chat here. Oh, thanks, Diana, for that pedagogy of kindness link. Daphne, yeah, it could certainly connect to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And there's things like student development theory you could explore related to that as well. It's, you know, it goes hand in hand with that idea. Storytelling, yeah, you know, sharing your personal experiences to build empathy with your students. But again, all of these need to connect back to some kind of action you can take to accomplish this in the classroom as well. Yeah, and I agree, Daphne, that trying to discuss that kindness, you know, without being too jargony or anything like that, right? These statements still should be written for a general audience for the most part. Though, you know, the folks on the search committees will have familiarity with teaching and learning. You know, you still have to keep that general audience in mind. Okay. Yeah, and you can see here from my slides here, I have slides from the past few years that will stay in here so you can see what other folks have said through the iterations of this presentation as well. You know, but also things like, you know, innovative things that are in teaching and learning. So if you, you know, AI might be something you broach talking about, but that's just a specific piece that might be something more for, you know, maybe you have an example of how you've approached AI in the classroom that you want to share as a component of using innovative technologies in your teaching to support student success. Right. So I hope you're seeing how some of these more broader ideas can connect to the more specific practices. All right. Any questions other questions before we move on, or other goals and practices? Again, this wasn't meant to be an exhaustive list here, but just to give you some ideas as a springboard for further reflecting on your own values and what you bring to the classroom. Let me put my thing back in presentation mode. That should be fine. All right, so now I just want to spend a minute talking about some common questions that I get about writing these statements. And I think I've answered some of them already because I knew they were coming, of course. But a primary question I get is, what if I don't have much teaching experience, right? By the time you're applying to positions, it could vary depending on if you're a grad student or a postdoc, or, you know, what opportunities you've gotten. So if you don't have much teaching experience, and you're a grad student and you're not applying for a job soon, right? That's something you want to think about too, is how you can gain some of that. Maybe you've done a guest lecture for your PI, or maybe you can think about that. You certainly have mentoring experience, I would imagine, if you're working in a research lab or doing research, or you're having students help you. If you've taught in a summer program, anything like that certainly counts as teaching experience. Right, mentoring in that kind of context where you're maybe showing someone protocols or guiding somebody through a project, that can certainly be considered teaching. And, you know, doing these kind of teaching professional development things, coming to series like this, going to other, you know, CELT and CIE workshops, can certainly inform what your classroom practice will look like. So you can, you know, sort of talk about, well, this is what I have done to develop my teaching, and this is what I would do if I was in the classroom, right? You can still have plans and start building those structures, at least, you know, on paper, if you haven't had those real classroom experiences. But again, right, it might be tricky to do that with confidence. So that kind of writing will take a little practice. So, I mean, that's why we have, you know, this series offers the reviews, and you're always welcome to follow up as well. So I mentioned a few ways to stand out from other applicants in the statement, right? The personal nature and the stories you're telling, with the overall goal of connecting these values to evidence. that's going to make you stand out, right? How are you starting your statement? What kind of stories are you telling? Are you using innovative teaching practices? Do you do a good job connecting, right? Like I said, I'm going to just keep harping on this one idea because it's really important that you're connecting your values and the theory to the classroom practices and the evidence that you have or would collect. So then, are detailed technical approaches in the classroom required? You have a couple of pages to talk about this. So you might list some specific strategies you've used or practices you've used and elaborate on them a little bit. I wouldn't go on for like a whole page about one specific thing you've done in the classroom because you do want to show a little bit of variety and flexibility as well. So the answer is sort of yes and no here, right? You want to have specific examples. You want to be telling stories about your teaching or mentoring experiences. And you want to show how that's connected to evidence of student learning. So again, yes and no. You don't want to be too detailed, but you do have to be specific with your examples and evidence. And then this question was asked earlier, can I incorporate positive comments received about my teaching? You can, right? But that's not the only evidence that you should have that your teaching is landing the right way with students. That can certainly bolster the connection between your values and practices. But you also want to be thinking about, right, the actual demonstration of student learning through, the assessments that you're giving in the classroom. You're going around and seeing students getting the right end marks, those other metrics. But yes, certainly incorporate those. And, some applications and schools might ask for different things, right? Some might only ask for a teaching statement. So then you might incorporate a couple of quotes here and there. Others might ask for a more detailed teaching portfolio where you would be including like all the reports of your teaching evaluations that you have, syllabi that you've used, sample assignments that you've given, things like that. So that has to be more, detailed, and there'll be more things that you're submitting with that. But even within just the context of the teaching statement, you can incorporate a couple of things. You don't want that to take over most of the text of your statement either, right? Because you still want to be talking about those examples and evidence. Daphne?
For those schools that don't ask for such an in-depth portfolio, apart from comments that we've received from students directly or like teaching evaluations that I have on file from classy evals, what then constitutes as evidence of efficacy? Because even then, like if students give you a good evaluation, that just, that doesn't necessarily mean you're good at teaching. It just means you're likable or you've had. So what constitutes evidence?
Right. Right. So, and I mean, and sometimes the evidence can come through in the evals. I don't want to exclude that completely as a possibility, but oftentimes that's not really the case, as you're implying as well. If a student's just saying, "Oh, they're the best teacher ever," that's nice. It's a nice thing to say, but it really doesn't show evidence. So that's things like, maybe you implemented a new blogging activity or something like that for students to share stories about their favorite science topic or whatever. And then, the scores were higher than you expected on an exam. I mean, this is just an example off the top of my head, but, or, you had an online discussion forum where, you had like 99% engagement and completion. Students passed, it's things to do more with grades and assessment. But also, as I mentioned, if the comments on the feedback are very specific, like, oh, this teacher used a lot of group work, and that I really valued that because in other classes that I haven't used group work, I didn't do as well on my exams, right? Something like that could lend to that evidence, but you just have to be careful with the context and the specifics. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the specific examples were helpful. Thank you.
Okay, great. All right, any other questions before we move on? We're getting in close to our writing prompt time. How am I doing on time? I don't have my clock out. Okay, it's 4:42. All right, so I just put together some quick reflections. I mean, these could certainly be longer writing prompts. As you'll see in a moment, I definitely turned one of these into a longer prompt. But just some broader areas you could think about and how you might achieve these in your statement. So general teaching philosophy, right? So I didn't mention this in the beginning, but the idea of a teaching philosophy is technically slightly different than the idea of a statement of teaching philosophy, right? Your teaching philosophy overall might be, you know, a couple of sentences or, you know, a paragraph about values and how you might generally accomplish those as an educator. I've seen teaching philosophies listed in like faculty bios and, you know, they're short, but these statements for the job application packages are really filling that out again with the evidence and examples. But again, to start building this, you can do what we've been doing all along here. What do you believe or value about teaching and student learning? What skills do you want to develop in your students, right, based on your discipline? So for teaching practice, what courses have you developed or TA'd or, you know, were lead instructor for? That is one option again for structuring your statement, is to talk about a couple of different courses you've taught. What courses or level are you qualified to teach, right? Are you interested in teaching large intro classes? Do you want to teach upper division? Have you taught those before? Have you taught online? Have you taught in person? You know, can you teach to non-majors? You know, things like that. What teaching methods or strategies do you use? This is where those active learning strategies come in. Things like think, pair, share, or case studies, or discussion forums, or again, incorporating innovative technologies into your teaching, inspiring growth mindset, you know, helping students with the learning process by doing reflection and helping with study habits, right? There's, you know, a very broad and open list of those that you can draw from. And then how do you approach assessment or collect evidence of student learning, right? You're teaching a topic, you're doing a lecture, you're giving some homework, you're giving projects, you're giving exams. How do those connect? Are those tools that you're using for assessment showing evidence that your students are learning? Teaching all students is another broad category. How do identities and experiences impact teaching and learning in your classes? Yours, your students, both. How will you tailor your teaching to, you know, the variety of students' needs and interests in your class? And then drawing on research and mentoring. How do your research and disciplinary contexts influence your teaching, right? Bringing research into your teaching could be another value. If you're, you know, talking about leaders in a field of research while you're doing a lecture topic, or you're bringing in specific like landmark experiments, or, you know, discoveries in the field to help teach the content, that could be another one of your values and practices. What experiences do you have mentoring undergraduates, you know, summer students, REU, you know, research experience for undergraduates, you know, mentoring in the lab, other rotation students or undergrads that might be working in the lab, etc. Okay. And you could come back to those, you know, that's a lot to think about at once, of course, but there are places to get started. And I just have, like I said, a lot of these and some more writing prompts just to give you plenty of options, because it can be hard to get started on one of these statements, and it's just best to start somewhere, right? Pick something that you're comfortable writing about and just start, and then you can start to build it into one of those structures. So I don't want to take too much time on this, but I'm going to read these 3 questions, and I want you to choose one prompt after I've read them, and we're going to work on that. Just jot some notes down for about maybe 5 minutes. And then if we get a few folks to share, that would be great. And then we can follow up just with plans for moving forward and continuing your draft. So question 1, and I just put the purpose of these, right? What will this help you achieve in your statement? Identify what you value as an educator and how you will bring these values to your students to help them succeed. Student success is definitely one of those buzzwords as well. Reflect on what elements of teaching and learning are most important to you. So we have done this a couple of times already in this session. And you could think of your time as a student and or educator, you know, to choose one value to elaborate on, right? And then so this is about maybe connecting some of that practice to the value or theory. How can you bring, or have you brought this value into your teaching? Be specific, right? So if your value was growth mindset, how have you accomplished that in your teaching? Question 2 is to practice making it personal. Connect what you do to evidence that it's effective. So share a brief story about a successful, I think this was supposed to say or unsuccessful teaching or learning experience you had, but then I changed it. So just ignore this. Or share a brief story about a successful teaching and learning experience you've had. How did you know it was successful, right? So again, connecting that idea of success to specific evidence. And since this is a story, it should have a beginning, middle, and end. You don't have to write out the whole story right now. But if you are telling an anecdote or thinking about storytelling, you need that structure there, right? So you're talking about your value, you're talking about how you did that, and then you're talking about how your students accomplished it, right? One example. And then, oops, sorry, question 3. So the purpose is to be able to convey how you will reach all of your students to support their success. How do you tailor your teaching to meet the variety of needs and preferences of your students? So that was on the previous slide. How do you ensure all students can learn successfully? So just choose one of those, jot down some notes. It'll take 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and hopefully get some thoughts from you. All right, I'll put it back. I'm just getting back into I want to see my clock. All right, so until 12:55, let's jot down some ideas. Just have to pick one.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
So questions, it seems to me maybe questions 2 and 3, like I can merge them together. Like I could,
Sure.
yeah, okay. Like I
Yeah,
can tell a
absolutely. Yep.
story, and then that's how all of my students reach success. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay, that's our 5 minutes. I see Carrie shared, answered a question too in the chat. Thank you. Bringing my own experiences and example of applications of concepts. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, and you could definitely find evidence in the literature for this as well, using stories or analogies, right, that can also tie into teaching complex concepts, bringing your own experiences in, helps students recognize ways that it connects to their own life, but also sharing your stories helps build empathy too. So I love that example. Thanks for sharing. So if anyone else who wants to share, you could raise your hand or write in the chat as well.
This might be a bit of a mess. I was trying to answer the first one, and I think as a student and educator, usually I really value like time, being able to reach out and like to the educator and then responding in like effective time, effective communication. Because as a student, I think the worst thing is when you're in a class and you want to get a good grade, but like for whatever reason, the teaching style is not matching your learning style. And so you feel like more stressed out. And so as an educator, I try to really take my time on certain concepts because I know that anxiety and I don't want students to have that. But then respect, I feel like respect is hard as an educator because you have put so much time into your lectures. And sometimes when you have those blank stares or those kind of like zoned out stares, everyone zones out. It's natural, but you start to wonder if you're effectively communicating, if you're helping them in any way. And then um, sometimes you might have students that kind of act up in some way. And I guess how I would try to, I don't think I've incorporated that enough, but how I would try to incorporate that in my teaching is doing those check-ins, like either at the end of the lecture or the end of the week, like what's a question you still have from the lecture, um, as a way to kind of measure we're all on the same page, or having a like where are we all at today type of thing.
Yeah.
Because we introduced that in this class I'm doing now, where the students had to talk. We talked about imposter syndrome one day, and the students just all just really opened up about all these like fears they were having. And I think it put a lot of things into it, kind of like breaks down barriers and like puts a lot of things in perspective. And for them to see even instructors go through it was helpful. So I feel like it's a lot of more feedback and um yeah, so that's a bit of a mess in my mind.
No, I mean, yeah, you have like a whole teaching statement there and just that one summary, which is awesome. I mean, that's there's a lot of good stuff in there. You're talking about uh formative assessment, right? With and check-ins and knowledge checks and making sure everybody's got the background knowledge that they need, or knowledge from the previous lecture to move forward. You're talking about building a culture of respect in your classroom and empathy again, where students can see some of themselves in the educator or the content, that they're comfortable sharing vulnerable things, right? That's a positive, shows a positive impact on the classroom environment. Yeah, so there's definitely ways to turn all of that, right? And you pick out some of the more either broad values or more specific stories you can get from there. And I think you hit on another good point, that starting out these teaching statements often is sort of like a mess, right? I mean, think about any other personal statements you've written over the course of academia or careers or anything, and it's kind of like just try to get a bunch of stuff out there, right? And then fit it into the structure. So I think your thought process is spot on. So lots of
Okay.
good stuff in what you said. All right, there's a couple in the chat. I'll get to the hands after I just read through these quick. Danielle says, student taking course for second time, unhappy with exam scores, reviewed exam together, took the time to find out time management was an issue. So you worked one-on-one to develop these skills. Oh, wow, grade up 30 points. Host an informal workshop on study techniques in STEM to help. Awesome. Yeah, that's a great story, Danielle. And I know I didn't read the whole thing out, so I apologize to folks that aren't reading along. I should have just read the whole thing. But so yeah, again, you're taking, individualizing support for students. You're building those soft skills in, right? Time management, study habits, and then, spreading that support to more broadly, reach more students. So that's awesome. And Kristen, I forgot to mention too, another component that you were really talking about also was timely communication, right? Or clear and open communication, frequent communication, right? Timely feedback. Those are all also components that can be connected to that. So there's lots of specific things that you can call out for your story. Gabriel said, during my time as a student, I had a few memorable experiences with teachers who truly engaged the classroom by encouraging active student participation. These moments often involved interactive activities and peer discussions, and I know they were effective because I still remember some of them vividly even 10 years later. Unfortunately, such teachers were rare, which led me to develop a strong personal value. If I were ever to become a teacher, I would strive to make my classroom as engaging and interactive as possible. I've carried this value with me throughout my career as both a researcher and an educator by designing lessons that prioritize discussion, inquiry-based learning, and collaborative projects. I consistently encourage students to question, explore, and connect ideas rather than passively absorb information, creating a dynamic and inclusive learning environment. So that's an awesome introduction to a statement, Gabriel. Yeah, that's really, really, detailed. It gives you places to focus on. It shows your values. It tells a story, and it really sets up where you're going to go from there. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that as an example for everyone. And Katie, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I answered question number 2. Yeah, again, it's also like very drafty, but I'm happy to share. I was teaching part of a course in cognitive modeling, and in that part of the course, I taught a lecture about a model that I made, and then that followed with like a lab session. And it was really, really nice because I mean, models can be so abstract and like difficult for students to grasp and like, in a short time slot. But I re-implemented the model in R, which the students were using for the course. And yeah, I'm not really sure what the middle is of this story, but anyways, it might just be a beginning and an end. But basically, it was really nice because I think the students could engage with the concepts on like suddenly, they could like really play around with the things that were going on. And I think one thing that's important to me, like to instill in students is critical thinking. And one thing that came out of this session was like the students were like, Katie, why did you choose this? Like, how does this map onto the real world? And I could really see that this, like, by having the students go into the code and change things and do these exercises, they could engage with the theory on such a deeper level than just by giving the guest lecture alone. So that was really fun. And I think it also gave me, like, because it was quite a long session, some students were done early with the lab session, but I mean, other students, I could just sit with them and really explain the concepts from the beginning and like have the time to do these more like one-on-one things. Or if I saw that a lot of students had the same question, I could go up to the board and discuss that in one go. So it also, which I think connects to another value of mine, is like to help support students who need that extra boost, to like have that as a possibility as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that could also be, both of those things could be fleshed out to make a nice chunk of your statement. You're, using modeling as a way to achieve critical thinking or, real world connections. You're also showing reflective practice in that because, you know, you saw that maybe some students were finished earlier, wanted to engage deeper with that. So that gave you an opportunity to think about how best to do that individual support, right? Which brings you to another value, which is this. Yeah, for sure. It's a great start. Yep. All right, cool. Anyone else want to share? Maybe we get one more before moving on to the next steps. If not, that's okay too. I think these give some nice examples of one, a nice structured introduction, but also it's totally fine if you're not there yet, right, with the structure and just ways to get started on connecting your values to more specific practices and evidence of student learning. Okay, this next slide I realize is like a mess of text, but I wanted you to remember that these writing prompts were in this extra resource I linked at the end. So I did not want to change that. Come on, go back. Okay. Just making sure I'm not missing anything in the chat. So there's even more questions in this handout too, but I curated some here. I'm not going to read through all of them, but again, these are just more places you can get started. Some are 1 to 2 sentences, some are, you know, longer prompts, but you can just basically pick any of these and start writing, and it could give you a piece to add to your statement. I liked some more of the discipline specific and like, you know, critical thinking focused questions that are in here, right? Like what knowledge, skills, and attitudes do you see as important for success in your discipline? How do you get students intellectually engaged with your field? What kind of questions do you ask? What kind of problems do you pose? You know, write about a moment when you were challenged by the task of teaching. You know, you could be a little honest in these statements. Not that you want to talk about like, you know, flat out failures that didn't go anywhere, but if you had a challenge that you learned something from and did something different next time, that shows you're being reflective, which is a really important component of the statement as well. What conceptions or misconceptions about your field do students bring to the classroom? You know, how do you address that? How can you explain difficult concepts in your field? Right. So these are a little more concrete and discipline related than what we've been thinking about. So doing a little bit of prompt, you know, writing prompts for both of those things, both the more general, you know, do some reflecting about your learning experiences and values, and do some practice writing with some more discipline specific or content based or, you know, specific teaching practice based ideas, and you'll have a really great start for your statement. So of course, then the next steps would be continuing to develop this, choose the structure you're going to use, and that you can of course explore as well. You know, we had the example of picking your top 3 values to turn into, you know, connections to more specific practices, or you could talk about different courses you've taught and sort of do that practices and evidence within each of the courses, or you can do a more, you know, heading based statement where you're breaking it down into different pieces like mentoring and assessment and classroom teaching. So again, yeah, why are you valuing these? Why are they effective in the sense of just, you know, evidence of learning and connecting to learning theory, and then describing the context and specifics. Add your anecdotes or evidence. What have you done? What will you do? How will you know your students are learning, or what have you done to assess them so far? And then get feedback on your draft, right? Once you have something going, and then you could bring it to the session on the 27th, right? That's when that is. Unfortunately, I can't be there that day, but we have some of my fabulous colleagues there to help with your revisions and advice. And like I said, you can always reach out to me directly as well. I had here some things you can start to explore for citations. I put some of these values or practices here in italics for each of these, how this might, you know, help you lend evidence from the learning sciences to these things you're writing about. But there's also lots of other options. And again, you know, this has added value to my own teaching statements. But again, you have to think about the context and if there's any specific guidance for what they want in the statement in the job application, which there probably won't be. They'll probably tell you write a teaching statement of, average length or something like that. But again, I don't want to like overwhelm you by making you think you have to learn a whole new body of research. These are, just some places to get started. And I mentioned, there's a citation for Think, Pair, Share. There's this active learning study, which I could also share in follow up. Molly, I'll get those to you. And then you could just share those too. And then I have some additional resources here. So this is where I got those writing prompts from. This MIT Communication Lab has a lot of great resources, but this set on teaching statements, there's a lot of like text-based advice, but at the bottom they have 2 fully annotated example statements. The color contrast is completely inaccessible, so I didn't want to show it here, but it could be helpful to go through those because it's sort of picking out like, okay, here's the piece that did this and why, and this is a good thing to add, or it really just, I could show it. No, I'm not gonna, but it's just gonna be confusing right now. But I do encourage you to take a look at that. This links to a folder of 3 sample teaching statements that were written by Stony Brook postdocs that got faculty positions. So I encourage you to take a look at those. It was 3 IRACTA postdocs that are willing to share their statements with you, sort of de-identified, and then just collections of other advice and examples. So we have some time for questions if anyone has other questions. Otherwise, wanted to say thanks for your attention and participation, but I am here, like I said, to answer some questions because we do have a few minutes. Kristen.
So I know usually DEI statements, the ones I've looked at, they still seem to include them in the teaching docket, or packet, whatever. But I'm wondering if they're not, if we should still kind of like include those in some of these in our teaching statement or our research
Right.
or cover letter, if they don't specifically ask for it, if it's still.
I think, yeah, especially now, right? That would be a place to kind of explore the values of the institutions you're applying to, right? To the extent you can. Because, right, we know, unfortunately, right now that those values may not be in alignment with some states or institutions. So that would be my best advice. Under normal circumstances, they might ask for a totally different DEI statement, which of course may somewhat overlap. But that could be a little more broad, I think. And these are where you're showing, because if inclusive teaching is a value to you,
Yeah.
and you're hopefully looking to an institution that aligns with that, right? That should come across in your teaching statement.
Okay.
But there's also some ways to talk about those kind of values too that keep it a little more broad, like learning for all students, right? Instead of using more buzzy words around DEI.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Molly, or Ash, I don't know if Ashley, no, Molly or Diana, if you have anything else to add to that, please let me know.
Diana, you have the flyer with the upcoming events, right? Okay, perfect.
Any other questions before Diana shares her announcements?
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, no, I think okay.
All right, awesome. I just wanted to put up on the screen our next couple of workshops for Faculty Career Path Series. So next week is going to be research statements on June 25th from 12 to 1:30. So same time as today. Also same Zoom link. Everything's on the calendar. So you can come on to that. Jennifer Albanese will be facilitating that one. And then the end of next week is going to be the application package review on June 27th from 10:30 to 1 o'clock. This is going to be a hybrid event where you can come in person to the Writing Center, or you can join us on Zoom, where you can work one-on-one with an application reviewer to go over one or multiple components of your application packet. So for both of these things, you can scan the QR codes at the bottom of this flyer. One is a QR code for the access to the general RSVP, and the other one is to sign up for your time slot for the application review. All right. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. This was really great.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks, Diana.
Thank you too.
Thanks everyone for
Thanks for
coming.
having us.
Thank you.
Molly, I could send you a couple of things that you can share out as
Yeah,
follow-up.
actually, if you send it to me and Diana, she's been sending out the follow-up very
Okay.
helpfully. So we'll make sure it gets out to everyone.
Awesome. All
Absolutely.
right. Thanks, everyone. I hope you found this helpful. Have a great day.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.